Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Let's Talk. I'm excited to talk today with Rachael Cooper. She's a senior program manager at the National Safety Council. But before I share her full bio, I just want to, as always, encourage you, please ask questions. It's not every day that you get an opportunity to talk to someone like Rachael. She's got so much expertise on employee wellness, employer responsibility in terms of employee wellness, particularly around mental health. So I know I'm excited to learn from her today, and hopefully you are too. So please contribute. We'll put your comments up on screen. We'll be able to engage directly with you. So please feel free to do that. So that said, let's dive in. So Rachael Cooper, she is the senior program manager and the opioid subject matter expert. That's how our paths crossed at the National Safety Council. I'm actually on their Physician Speakers Bureau, which is how we know each other. But she oversees initiatives related to substance use, mental health, and the workplace. She is an expert on the intersection between the workplace and mental health and best practice approaches to support employee well-being and make the workplace positive as opposed to a negative. So, Rachael, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, of course. Well, maybe you could just get us started with telling us a little bit, what's your role at NSC like? What are you working on? Where does your passion come from?
Sure. So NSC, or the National Safety Council, is a congressionally chartered nonprofit coming from the 1910s, right? So we have been proponents of workplace safety from the days of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire back in the 1910s, and have really taken a data-driven approach over the past 100+ years to really look at what impacts safety, what drives injuries, what drives fatalities. So that has covered a multitude of topics over the years. We do have a full transportation and roadway division as well. My personal focus, though, is on the workplace and employees in particular, and specifically the intersection with substance use, with mental health, all of those topics that are so top of mind coming out of 2020 and still existing in the state of the pandemic. And on a personal note, my background is in direct service, so doing frontline opioid overdose prevention work. I did that both in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as well as abroad in France. And many of the people that I saw and helped were employed. Some 70+% of people who have a substance use disorder are in the workforce, and more people use substances who don't have a substance use disorder, and they're in the workforce as well. So how can we support people? Employees are human, and employees are also the greatest strength that an organization can have. So that's really where my passion comes from, and for really supporting the greatest strength an organization can have, which is their employees.
Yeah, and I know when I first started getting involved with NSC, learning a little bit more about you, this idea of eliminating preventable death just really resonated with me, particularly around the opioid epidemic, where I've been very active. And I know that we're not going to go as deeply into that today. Certainly, we could talk a lot about it, and I think your work there is as important as it's ever been in COVID, with the 50% increase that we're seeing nationwide in overdose deaths. But today, that part that you mentioned about really honing in on how do we leverage the workplace, how do we leverage employers and employees to improve mental health or support mental health is going to be what we're going to examine. And so we're going to break our conversation down today into two halves. The first half is going to be talking about how the work experience, the workplace experience impacts employees and what we should know about that. And the second half is as an employer, and this could go for listeners who might be in leadership positions in organizations or in HR positions, or even those who are just interested in the subject about how potentially your workplace could be enhanced. How the employer can potentially take responsibility for the mental health of the people who are working for them, because, like you said, we're all people, not humans.
Right.
It's a great way to get good turnover. But so let's start with the basics. From the employee's side, what role does the workplace have on employee health and well-being from a scientific perspective? What should we be thinking of?
Sure. So I think one thing just to start is recently Mental Health America released data from a survey that they did between February 2020 and September 2020. So we're obviously looking at, the COVID initial state of COVID, right? Those first stay-at-home orders, the quarantine, well before reopening, then through some of the reopening stuff, and depending on your state, obviously that manifested very differently. And during that time frame, 85% of respondents, of employees, said that the workplace impacted their mental health, and 83% said that they were experiencing emotional exhaustion related to their mental health. So what we're seeing here is you can't untangle the workplace from the real world. And that has been highlighted so clearly over the past year plus, but it bears mentioning again, right? Because we're human, we bring our stuff to work. Some of us are, now working from home, and that really blurs the line between work and home. So this is all manifested differently. But, in terms of how the workplace can impact mental health, I suppose that goes back to the question of, what is mental health, right? And mental health is how we deal with the world. It's our resilience, it's our coping strategies, it's how we face challenges, it's how we navigate complex situations. And this is all we've been doing for the past year in particular. The exhaustion or the fatigue component is really important, first of all, because when you're tired, your capacity to deal with challenges, to be resilient, is absolutely reduced. We can all say that, over the past year, there's been days burnout. I mean, for me, it was the month of December. I was just done. Looking back at it, I can very clearly mark that I had just hit a wall, and I hit it like kind of face first, to be honest with y'all. I hit it like right straight into it. And I was like, in retrospect, I'm like, oh my gosh, Rachel, like, you work on this. How did you not see it? Like, how did you not see this coming? And at the same time, that's why
I emailed you, you just sent back little crying emojis. That's all I got.
That's exactly what I did. That's totally.
It'd be like, here's a technical question, and you'd send me back. Yeah. So
I was very professional. I'm joking too. But I think the other thing is that this has highlighted stuff for people that perhaps previously they were able to cope with in a more healthy way, and now some of those coping mechanisms were gone. For example, people who use physical activity as a coping mechanism, right? When gyms were shut down, or maybe you don't feel safe going, or just going outside to go for a walk, especially for people who have health conditions or who are living with loved ones who may have a health condition. And then for people who are working in the frontline space, I mean, it's just constant. It was a chronic state of fear, of exhaustion, of anxiety. So what that does in the workplace, I mean, in theory, we all want to bring our best selves to work every day, but some days we can't. And that's just the state of being human. But what that looks like from an employee perspective, especially if you don't feel safe in that space, if you don't feel like maybe you can take an afternoon off because your child is struggling with virtual learning, or if you may have had maybe a COVID exposure, but you don't want to disclose that because you don't know if you're going to lose your job. All of those things, that's part of like the everyday employee experience right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and I'd love to get your take on this because you have a much better vantage point than I. It feels like, particularly towards the beginning and middle of COVID, and maybe so now as well, that employers were kind of like, they're in this position where, because people are very nervous about COVID, they're concerned about their own health. There's these questions of, am I going to be forced to come back to work?
Right.
Am I not? Are there going to be accommodations? And it almost feels like there's an opportunity right now where employers and businesses could either really show their employees how much they value them, or the opposite, where they can make them seem like, no, like, you need to be here. Have you? Is it really bipolar like that, or is it much more of a spectrum?
I think it depends on I think it's a spectrum, but I think what happens is sometimes there's a disconnect between the employers and the employee in the space. So what feels important to the employee is not necessarily what feels important to the employer. And I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who is, in theory, their workplace is returning to in-person work sometime in the next few months. And they had a staff meeting, and they had a set of questions that they wanted to go through to gauge employee reaction, right? And one of the questions on the thing was, what are we going to do about potlucks? And I was like, potlucks? And my friend was like, potlucks? Like, that is not what I'm concerned about right now. I'm not concerned about the sharing of food in the workplace or anything like that. I'm concerned about my actual physical safety in the workplace, So it's like, it's this disconnect, I think, sometimes that can happen where, you're trying to be proactive and you're thinking about the things that make the workplace, nice and connected, like, for example, potlucks or employee or staff events, etc. But that's not, where the general employee is at. It really, it's, am I going to be safe? Is my family going to be safe? It really comes back to that, just that very personal level of safety.
Right, right. And certainly, I mean, when we think of work stress, whether COVID related or not, it's has such a huge bearing on just our regular stress in life. I mean, many of us are working for if not the majority of our waking hours, a really good chunk of it. And so if it's something that you don't find as meaningful, or if you're in a workplace culture that feels oppressive or negative or pessimistic, I mean, that can really rub off. Now, something that I was really interested in learning more about when you mentioned it the other day, because I'm not as familiar with this term, was the idea of a psychologically safe workplace. So could you explain a little bit more about like what that means and how we would know if we're in?
Sure. And just before, I want to touch on one thing you said real quick before I go to that. When we're talking about workplaces that maybe are negative or pessimistic. The other thing that's just true is, the workplace has had a really tough time during COVID as a general rule. People or employers who are experiencing financial instability or their bottom line is really hurting because of COVID, layoffs, etc. These are not necessarily, quote unquote, like the workplace's fault, right? This is not a state of intentional or like, I don't care about what the employees are saying or thinking or feeling. It's just the state of things. So, and that translates down, even if it's not your job to worry about the budget, or it's not your job to worry about, the fiscal future of your organization, the fear of getting laid off, seeing upper level management or C-suite executives being stressed about this. I mean, transparency is really important, but it does come at the point of, well, your employees are going to know that this is risky, that there is risk in this. And that is another, given the unemployment rates, given all of the things, that's certainly a level of concern for employees that is hard to turn off. About a psychologically safe workplace, though. So when you hear the term psychological safety, most people focus on that first word, psychological, right? And that makes you think of, shockingly, psychology, and shockingly, feelings and mental health and well-being. But it really goes beyond just that. So Amy Edmondson is a person who's been working in the space for a long time, and her definition of psychological safety is the one that is most frequently used, though not all workplaces use the term. And what it is, do I feel safe to be myself at work? Do I feel safe to have a difficult conversation? Can I highlight a safety hazard? If I go to HR because of worker-to-worker conflict or an issue with my supervisor, is that going to be heard? Will there be repercussions? Can I be the person that steps up and says, I don't think this is right, even though it goes against the norm? And that is something that is a constantly evolving process in the workplace, right? Because everybody's going to feel slightly different about it. But it really goes to saying, if I can go to my supervisor and, to use the previous example, say, hey, my kid's having trouble with virtual learning, I have to take the afternoon off. If there's no repercussions, then I can do that. If there's not, then I'm halfway doing both things, trying to pretend that I'm like, online, turning my video off during calls maybe, or emailing from my phone when it's like that kind of stuff. It can, and you're just distracted and you're not focused, but you're also scared about, am I going to lose my job? So that's really what we talk about psychological safety is, can I be myself? Can I make a mistake? Can I be honest about what's happening without fear of repercussions personally or professionally?
So I guess a question about that. So how do you differentiate then between, so I really like that idea that safety comes from being able to be open and yourself and have that be okay. How do you differentiate between, like, say, accommodations? Like on the one hand, it's things like saying, like, like, I'm struggling at home, or this is going on, or, versus just maybe having a personality that's a little bit, that doesn't entirely mesh with everybody else, or not necessarily that you're annoying or inappropriate, but just something where you're different. Does that factor into safety, or is it more just about, can I say things without worrying for my job?
It certainly factors into safety. I mean, I think we've all been in spaces before, maybe in your personal life, maybe in your professional, where you're like, I really just don't fit in. I mean, if we all think back to like the dreaded middle school and high school days, right? I mean,
I
that's
blacked those out. I didn't comb my hair and I wore sweatpants every day, and I don't remember what happened. We'll just put.
yeah, I am not. I'm kind of with you on that one, especially the middle school part. Like, oh, yikes. So
yeah, let's not talk about that. Let's move on.
We won't go too far into that. But really, when I think about, differentiating between the two, that is a space where employers are going to employees and employers are going to experience doing that differently, right? I think that the flexibility that's been created by the pandemic in some ways could really help people who struggle in that space. Like, for example, some people love an office atmosphere. Some people love the break room chats and the cubicle stuff, and being able to wander down and sit outside with somebody and just have a walking meeting, for example, like that kind of stuff, where you're not on Zoom all the time or whatever the case may be. So people are much more productive in the office. Some people, it's the opposite, right? And this is, now we're learning that this is a doable thing where people can, work remotely, much more frequently than I think anybody thought was possible, and still be, if not as productive, more productive, right? So I think that the flexibility provided and not really, it means also that people don't have to label it, right? Like, well, I'm not a particularly social person and I'm not comfortable in the workplace. You don't have to say that. You can say, I just prefer to work from home, right? And then it kind of gives you the privacy, but also enables you to be open about what works for you. And I think that kind of, flexibility is important as an employer. And it's obviously not always possible, right? I mean, if you have a job that requires being in person, people who are in the service industry or in retail, people who work in the construction or other trade organizations, like, you have to go in person, right? But for other industries where it's possible, this remote work stuff could really create an environment which is safer. That being said, for some people, the workplace is their safe space, right? Like, if you've got stuff going on at home, if you need some privacy, we see this with telehealth, right? Like, in theory, it's a great tool, but if you don't have privacy to talk to your doctor and you have people listening in because you don't have your space, well, that's a problem for a lot of people because it's medical, right? So it's a balanced approach is really what we always talk about, balance, for a reason. So even though it's hard.
Well, now in the pandemic with these mixed teams or remote teams, it gets even a bit more complicated.
Yeah.
So from the employee perspective, I know that, like, just even thinking back through some of my past work placements, or some people listening might be reflecting on their own job and maybe thinking like, yeah, no, this feels pretty good. Like, I can be myself. I'm validated. I'm appreciated. I'm supported. For listeners who might be thinking, all right, so I don't think I'm in a psychologically safe workplace. I really don't feel like that characterizes my job. As an employee, what can you do? Do you just kind of have to start looking for a new place to be, or is there really anything that you can do while you're still within that system?
I mean, it's tough because that literally goes to the definition of psychological safety. Do you put yourself out there and say, hey, I don't think this is a mentally safe space or a psychologically safe space for me to be working because of, the norms. So, I mean, really, as an employee, if you have a person that you trust, that knows your workplace, right? And we all have that kind of person, right, that we work with, that, they're your person, right? Like, you can troubleshoot with them, even if they're not in your department and not on your team. Like, if you had a weird interaction with somebody or you're not sure what to do, how to navigate a workplace situation. I mean, in theory, does everybody say, take it to HR and follow the da-da-da? Yes, but it often takes us time to go to HR. HR is not something that people necessarily trust. Same goes for, like an employee assistance program, an EAP. In theory, they're great, but people don't trust that they're confidential, so they might not use them. If I'm going to call and say, hey, I need help because I have a substance use disorder or because I'm experiencing a mental breakdown, I'm not going to call them if I think they're going to tell my employer, right? When literally the point is I'm scared about losing my job. So, if you have a person, that is, it's so like vague to say that, but it's really true, who's your person, who knows the workplace. I have a couple of people at work that if I'm like, I don't know how to handle the situation, just even getting kind of like a landscape analysis, like, hey, what do you think I could do? What about this? What about that? And then of course, even if you think that maybe like the higher up component of your workplace or HR isn't necessarily supportive, if you are lucky enough to have a good supervisor, oftentimes your supervisor is the door to the rest of the organization, and he or her can support you in whatever the next steps may be. And I think that, if you're listening and you are a supervisor or a manager, there are some things that you can do to really proactively, to really proactively talk about how can I best support you, working with people to say, hey, when do you do your best work and where do you do your best work? What is your learning style? What can I help you with? What is the most stressful thing for you? Even just really like, how do you receive feedback? Those kinds of questions, getting to know somebody really starts to build that trust relationship. And that trust relationship is absolutely, the key to all of this. You're not going to trust everybody in your workplace equally. However, if you can start to build that with your team, and you could maybe even suggest this to your manager or suggest this to, if you have, like a health and wellness team at work, what does this look like? Those kinds of things, those like, I hesitate to use this word like little things, but they are smaller steps. You don't have to fix everything all at once, right? Those smaller steps, but helping people just feel safe is something that we can all do better at all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it really is such a huge construct of what allows you to trust, what allows you to feel safe.
Right.
And I guess it's probably a personal choice when you're looking at your own situation, saying like, does this look like it's malleable? Can it change?
Right.
Or is it really just going to be like screaming into the void? And yeah, I mean, maybe at a certain point you do need to leave.
Right.
But I don't know. I tend to be to fall on the optimistic side and say that if there's a groundswell of support for something different, that you might be able to see movement.
Mm-hmm.
But to that end, so a related question, and this was something I'd done some study of employee wellness recently,
Sure.
and some best practice examples from corporations that did it well. And one of the points that I think caught some people off guard as I was presenting on this information is the idea of personal self-disclosure of behavioral health or mental health concerns, when it's appropriate, when it's not. Because I think that can feel very threatening, right? If you
Yes.
tell a supervisor like, hey, like I'm actually not coping with all this pandemic stress so well, or I'm actually struggling a bit, we tend to view that, and this could go off on a whole nother tangent about stigma, but we tend to view that as less acceptable than saying that, like I have kidney failure, or
Right.
or
Right.
I have plantar fasciitis or something,
Right.
that's seen as more okay because it's physical. So how would you recommend working around that? Do we need to be taking cues from our manager? Is it really, I know we're going to talk about the employer side in a minute,
Mm-hmm.
but is it
Mm-hmm.
really incumbent on like C-suite on down to set the tone for disclosure and acceptance, or how do we handle that?
That's a really good point, because when I think about the C-suite level of, setting an example and being a leader, right? We know that when you're talking about, and just to, to touch on stigma quickly, that one of the important things about all of this is open conversation and open discussion and knowing what resources are available. And that looks like so many different things, right? Newsletters, blurbs, stuff on the internet. But it also, we know that when a workplace has a champion for these things, that's really helpful, because it does really reduce the stigma. And because you can say, hey, the VP of finance, has really championed this employee well-being initiative, or, our chief HR officer has disclosed that, somebody in his family has a substance use disorder and has shared his story. We know that there's power in that, but you're absolutely right in that regardless of who discloses what on the high level, you shouldn't be required to disclose anything about your mental health, your behavioral health, substance use, etc., to get accommodation in the way that you may need. And the lines get blurry. When you have a team who's really tight knit, and you're joking around and you're sharing stories, and maybe somebody's getting divorced, and maybe somebody's getting married, maybe somebody's having a baby, maybe during the pandemic, right? I mean, everybody really was vulnerable in a way that they maybe hadn't been in their workplace previously. And taking cues from a manager, you still have to set your own boundaries, you know?
Yeah.
So you don't, even if your manager is a person who shares a lot about himself or herself, that's fine, but you do not have to reciprocate in order to be treated fairly. And if you feel like you are being pushed to that point, then what we talked about earlier, finding somebody you trust in the workplace, possibly utilizing the EAP, going to HR is absolutely, those are all options for you. Alternatively, you know, if you want to disclose and you're scared about what your manager may or may not do, then that might be, again, a case where you skip that step if you do need to accommodate, and you can go to HR. You know, this is, at the end of the day, about your health. And that is, first and foremost, you know, it's about your health, it's about your safety. So there's no good answer, I guess,
Yeah.
is what I'm saying. But like,
yeah, absolutely.
we all function differently in that way.
Yeah, well, and I guess my mind is going towards this idea of when trying to combat the stigma, which causes tremendous problems for organizations and for the employees. Who goes first? You know, and like, where do you start to change culture? Well, one of the things that I was reading as a potential way to do this is for a manager to approach an employee and like asking how you're doing, even like not saying like tell me about your mental health diagnoses, but say like, hey, so how are you dealing with this? You haven't been in the office for a while. Like what's going on? Is there any like are you under a lot of pressure? How are you doing? And like but kind of even utter it in the same sort of way that you might if someone had rolled their ankle and you knew that they were hurting. Like we've all collectively rolled our psychological ankle over the past year, but really just acknowledging that, and then maybe even self-disclosing if it's appropriate, right? Saying like, I know that this has really been tough because my kids are doing remote learning and like that sort of thing. How do you feel about that approach from management?
I think it's a great approach. I mean, I think, you know, humanizing the conversation and just seeing if people are willing to walk through the door and to not also give up after one attempt, I guess, because not all of us are, you know, are in a space to mentally disclose or to have the conversation necessarily when somebody asks. I think that, you know, yesterday I was taking a survey and I was just crabby. I don't know why. I was just in a mood and I was thinking about my responses and I'm like, wow, if you took this in a day when you were in a good mood, like today I'm in a great mood. You know, if I had taken it on a day when I was in a great mood, my survey responses would have been wildly different because that's the way it goes. So, I think the consistency and the continuity of checking in is important because it also establishes like, I'm going to keep doing this because I still care. You know, even if you're not opening the door, some people do it during, you know, team meetings. Do they do a group check-in? Some people aren't going to be comfortable sharing in a group setting, of course. But that's also, you know, an option just to kind of, you know, have that be a team norm, right? That we do check-ins and that you're not required to say anything, but you can if you want to. I also, you know, hey, if it, you know, sometimes it just doesn't work in the moment ever, but you can also, you're setting yourself up as a person to reach out to, you know? So that's a really positive thing as well.
Right. Well, so before we move on to the employer responsibility inside, one other term that I had not heard before, but as someone who's an addiction specialist, I'm very interested in is this idea of a recovery-friendly workplace. Yeah. So what specifically does that mean for folks who are in recovery or trying to change their relationship with the substance? Sure.
So recovery-friendly workplaces, you also could possibly end up hearing them called recovery-ready workplaces, which is a somewhat more new term for them. And then also NIOSH calls them workplace-supported recovery programs because syllables, I guess, I don't know. But the idea is, you know, how are we supporting employees in recovery? And, you know, this kind of goes back in a lot of ways to the conversation we just had about disclosure. Because nobody's required to disclose that they're in recovery. And also everybody's definition of recovery can be very different. You probably have people in your workforce who are living in recovery or who have a loved one living in recovery that you don't know about. And you're not going to, even if you do a full workplace initiative on substance use. Again, people are not required to disclose that they, maybe had a substance use disorder at one point, or that they are in recovery now or in treatment or whatever the case may be, right? So, but what it manifests as is, sometimes people in recovery do need different types of flexibility or support, right? So let's just say in theory that you are a person who attends some group therapy, and in the world where we're not in COVID and go places in person, right? What does that look like? Do you have the flexibility in this? In my previous life, a lot of people who live in more rural areas don't have a ton of options for meetings or for groups. And what if you work second shift, right? Or if you are, for example, prescribed methadone for an opioid use disorder, and you need to be at the clinic every morning sick for 6 days out of the week for an indefinite time frame. Sometimes those days go really quickly. Sometimes they don't, right? And what if you're late to work? Do you get a half point knocked off or whatever when you're just taking care of your health? So what does this look like? So it's really about, first of all, you kind of have to have a psychologically safe workplace to really make this work, because employees are going to need to be able to talk to you about, hey, I'm in treatment for this, or I'm in recovery from this, and these are the parameters that I have to abide by for my mental and physical health, right? So it's some of it is just that policy stuff, right? Can I use PTO? Do I have to take, I worked at a place once where you had to take sick time in 4-hour chunks, and you would go through that so quickly, especially if you had a kid, right? Especially if you had a kid who was also possibly you were going to need to take sick time to deal with your kids, whatever, at whatever given point. But let's just say you have to be at these appointments, then what do you do, right? So part of it's just policy, and that's like the unsexy way of talking about it. But also it's, again, to that stigma reduction thing. Having a recovery-friendly workplace openly acknowledges the possibility that some of the employees or the employer themselves, who knows, is or maybe in recovery. This is, again, and it's not calling people out, and it's not saying, here, we're going to put you on a pedestal and now you have to be the example for the rest of the workforce. But it's also, sometimes it can manifest as like, instead of doing work happy hours, is there something else that y'all can do that doesn't involve alcohol? If we do a holiday party, do we have fun mocktails or non-alcoholic drinks, or people just going to be sitting there doing whatever, and just like, well, here's my water while everybody else is getting intoxicated around me. What does a safe space look like? What are the alternatives? And, it also requires a lot of employer education and awareness about what recovery is, because when we look at how it is portrayed, a lot of people automatically jump to 12-step programs and complete sobriety from all substances, and that's not necessarily the case. So it's really, education and awareness, and really consciously challenging your own brain to say, am I thinking about this because I saw Requiem for a Dream, or am I thinking about this because, I actually took the time to learn about it and learn about the resources in my community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes back to this question of, are we looking at addiction as a health condition?
Right.
And are my coworkers looking at it that way? Is my manager looking at it that way? And I like your thoughts about policy. That's where my mind had not gone there at first. But I'm imagining a situation where, say, that an addiction had gotten out of control and had gotten to the point where
Right.
coworkers were aware that someone had this problem because maybe they were coming to work intoxicated, and then they go
Right.
off to treatment, and treatment is successful, and now they're back again. And how is that then a safe situation for them? Are they going to be stigmatized? Are people going to be making
Right.
comments? Are people going to have these inaccurate notions that they can't trust the person anymore because
Right.
they've had this problem? There's a lot of these frames of someone who has an addiction. I mean, I'm going to say the word even though I don't like it, because it's stigmatizing, but of addicts, right?
Yep.
Or of
Right.
alcoholics.
Absolutely.
And that has so many negative connotations, and that phrase
Yep.
is so ubiquitous that I feel like people almost feel like if they re-enter that same workplace without, say, transferring to a different location or to a different
Right.
team,
Right.
that they're gonna feel like all eyes are on them because like their health condition is one where now everyone's looking at them funny, whereas someone
Right.
else's might be.
Right. And, it goes to, if you can really take a step back and really look at topics like bullying and harassment, right? I mean, this is not that, sorry for the double negative there, but, with bullying and harassment and the ways that can manifest and the ways that people end up feeling unsafe or targeted in the workplace, there aren't there's not, we in the States, we don't have a particularly robust set of regulations surrounding bullying and harassment in the workplace, right? In the discrimination component, yes, but the bullying and harassment part, and this is very much something that people who are returning to the workplace after struggling with a substance use disorder could absolutely experience, right? Because if you are looking at this and saying, like, exactly like you said, well, people knew or they know, but I don't have an opportunity to change. And also, we know that financial stability is really, really important, and having employment, when it's in the right situation, employment supports recovery and recovery supports employment, and having a sense of purpose is a really important thing for all of us, in recovery or not, right? So when we're looking at this and we're saying, like, am I going to be targeted? What is the way forward here? How do I walk back into that room? And there's two things that made me think of. And one is that, some places have a zero tolerance policy for bullying, harassment, gossip, etc. And to me, zero tolerance is always it's a finicky phrase, because it does open up it doesn't let people make mistakes, and I think that, to our earlier point about psychological safety, we have to be able to make mistakes because we're human. But simultaneously, when it's about somebody else and their well-being, health, well-being, and safety, that is a different conversation. The second part that I was thinking about is, employers and HR, along sometimes with MROs, EAPs, et cetera, can, and the employee themselves, right? And can craft a return to work policy, and not policy, a return to work program individualized to the employee. And that's a really useful tool. And it can feel really complicated, I think, especially if you haven't done that before. But frequently people do this all the time with occupational injuries, right? Like, you're coming back to work, but your knee hasn't fully healed from the thing that happened a few months ago, and you can't do exactly the job that you were doing before. You're going to work back to it, but you need to have some accommodations prior to. And that is where an employee who, has the capacity, and sometimes you do need a champion in the space, and it might be your supervisor or manager, can negotiate in things like, okay, well, on Thursdays I need to leave at 3 because I have to go to my meeting, or, I am not going to start at 7, I'm going to start at 8 because we need to give a buffer because of my morning stuff that I have to do. And this is, I'm concerned about integrating into the team, so I'm going to start just half days for a while. And then, it has to be matched on the other side, of course, by cracking down on things like gossip and the jokes. And this goes to, like, employee education and awareness as well, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we've all said stuff in the workplace that you're like, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. Whoops. Yeah. But oftentimes it's not a whoops. It's like, oh, that was actually harmful.
Right. Well, so I guess this is maybe a good bridge into talking about what is the employer's responsibility. And as we switch, I'm just going to put another plug. If you have questions, listeners, please put them in, and we'll take them as we can. But why? So aside from the human element, where certainly, employers would just, again, from a very human perspective, want their employees to feel safe, want them to not be feeling psychologically oppressed in some way. Why should employers care about employee mental health? Why should that be on their mind?
Yeah, that is the question, right? And a couple things. One is that, just from a purely logistical standpoint, happy or content employees are more productive and they get more done. And we all know that the vibe in a workplace is a real conversation, even if we don't want to call it like a vibe because that sounds exceptionally unscientific. But that's really a lot of it, right? Is, hey, how are we existing in the workplace, and what are the benefits? And this is kind of looks at like this. It's almost like a total worker health paradigm, which is a NIOSH term, which is you're really
sorry. What is NIOSH? I'm not familiar.
Oh, sorry, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. So they do a ton of work on everything, and they. Occupational safety and health leads you to think that it's workplace, right? And it is workplace, but they have a program called Total Worker Health, and it's really integrating protection from it's like work-related safety stuff, so health, hazards, and we're talking about everything from like slips, trips, and falls to ladder safety, et cetera. But it's also has to do with the illness prevention and advancing like total worker well-being. And the reason why this essentially exists is because healthy and well workers benefit every single part of your business. And it just from the financial component, which I don't like to monetize well-being because I think it does a disservice to the human nature of it. But it is true, right? Your people are more productive. There are fewer errors in the workplace when people are healthy or well or not impaired due to, stress or mental health issues or substance use, et cetera. And it just, from just like the safety standpoint too, people aren't distracted. Distraction's really dangerous. When we're working from home, I mean, it feels less dangerous because, we're sitting at home, we're on our computer, but, are you really looking around for tripping hazards in your house? We have 2 10-month-old kittens right now, and they are in and of themselves a tripping hazard. But what am I going to do? They're cats, right? Or is the kid
occupational hazard?
Oh, for serious, right? I'm like, can I report that? Is that a reportable? Do you have a code? Like, what does this look like? So I mean, it's really recognizing hazards as more than just physical hazards, right? It's looking at stress. It looks at all of those different things, and it also looks at things like how wages or workload or interactions with your coworkers or your supervisors, how that can impact your performance in the workplace. And it's really just about, can we be safe and healthy at work? It still feels like, it's like one of those holistic models, and it's a little tough sometimes when you think about the traditional worker safety framework or workplace safety framework. It doesn't always feel easy to like pull together, but that's really the kind of the why. Are we designing a healthy workplace? What does that look like?
Well, so maybe call me like a little bit cynical about it, but I want to come back to this question of monetizing wellness, because I think that at the end of the day, a lot of times, if particularly right now when things are very tight, and in a lot of businesses, they're thinking, so like, why should I invest in this?
Sure.
Why is this where I should put it? If we're worried about the business, or even if it's money for enhancement, you're trying to improve something, why should we put it there? Some of my research found actually that all of the studies that look at this show that actually investing in employee wellness is a revenue positive expenditure.
Yes, it is.
That actually, like you were saying, because people are more productive, they're more engaged, they're more loyal, you'll have lower turnover, less burnout.
Right.
That ultimately, although it is the right thing, as a psychologist, I try not to like right and wrong. It is the right thing to do, but it's also a good business decision.
It is, and then you're right. I mean, it's. I think the way that because I also work mentally on squaring this in my brain, because, like I said, I don't like to monetize too much the human experience, especially when people are suffering, right? Like, it's not a space that I necessarily want to, spend too much time like talking about the money, but it is really important, and it's important for employers because when you think about it, I mean, especially if you have an employer-sponsored healthcare plan, for example, you're spending money on people's substance use disorder treatment. You're spending it on their prescriptions. You're spending it on their behavioral health. This is money that you are spending. And a kind of a shameless plug that, in the month of May, we'll be releasing what we call a mental health cost calculator to look at some of the data from the past few years, a combination of factors of data sources, including the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which talks about mental health, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, et cetera, healthcare costs. But we have released recently, a substance use cost calculator. And I know we're not talking about substance use per se here, but I just wanted to highlight, some of the main takeaways, which is that, we look at, for example, let's just say you work in construction, per the National Survey on Drug Use and Health with all of these other data factors, we're looking at almost 1 in 5 construction workers who have a substance use disorder. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of people. That is a lot of safety impacts. That is a lot of culture that is influenced, by this. And what we learned is that, untreated substance use disorders cost employers slightly over $8,000 a year per employee, slightly over per employee. That number climbs for executives, administrators, managers, et cetera, up to close to $15,000. Again, that's a lot of money, especially in, like you were saying, we're all strapped for cash right now. This is not an easy time. However, we also learned that, when you support employees through treatment and into recovery, you're looking at a total savings of, I just mentioned that 14,000 number, over 15,000 for those same people You save money by supporting people. And then there's that X factor. People who are passionate, engaged, and loyal to their workforce. Turnover is a huge issue across the board right now. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Turnover is absolutely something that employers are really concerned about, and aging of the workforce and healthcare costs and all of these things. But we can address that, by supporting our employees and, kind of doing that thing that's sound like too, like, I don't know, it's still like a vague term, like the holistic health and like treating people like humans, right? But it is what it is. That's exactly what it is, is like, hey, there are, not only there are financial benefits to supporting people through treatment and recovery. And, I'll look forward to sharing the mental health data once it comes out in May and revisiting that conversation because, even though we're talking about, roughly 1 in 5 people experiencing a diagnosable mental illness, all of us experienced mental distress last year. Every single one of us experienced mental distress last year, and most of us do at some point anyway. Rarely is it as chronic as it was over the past year, but we all experience. So it's not just the diagnosable stuff, it's also just like the being a human.
Well, it all makes a difference. It all makes a difference, and I think what's neat about the cost calculator is that I feel like the intuitively we know that it makes a difference. Intuitively, we know that when we are suffering, we are not doing our best. We are not maybe sleeping as much. Maybe eventually we would want to leave our job, and but to actually be able to put a number value on it, I think one of the hardest parts about any sort of prevention or resilience training or any sort of that end of things is that you're talking about cost saving from that model when you're looking at it from like population health and a business perspective. And sometimes that's a really tough sell, even if it's very clear that actually, like as a business, you're going to benefit on your workforce will be better. They will feel better. They will perform better. It's tough if you can't say, and here's why we should spend potentially a large amount of money on this. Why that should be a line item. So I think being able to actually quantify it, even if it does kind of turn people into numbers, which is not the best policy in many ways, it can actually be useful in some contexts.
And that really speaks to the rest of the employer role, which is that leadership component. It is the culture of psychological safety. It is providing the education and training. And for people who, for example, some people are, doesn't matter if you're national or a local organization, your workplace, and most workplaces still do have a building that they're in. Not all workplaces, obviously, at this point, or a community that they exist in. Even if you are a contractor and you happen to live in, I don't know, Idaho, like you're still in Idaho, right? Like that's still like where you're at. Maybe you work for a construction union or something like that, or maybe you work remotely, and whatever the case may be. But, what are the resources in the community? Who can you partner with? What you'll find is a lot of places are able to partner with local community organizations, maybe do a brown bag lunch, bring in somebody to talk about, hey, this is the local drug-free communities coalition, and they work with kids, right? Just that kind of stuff that really expands people's knowledge of what's available in the community, in combination with making sure people are aware of, benefits and, workplace options. But again, hey, not everybody's going to be covered by your workplace healthcare. So they might be covered by their spouses or something like that, right? But, what does the rest of that look like? So you have the monetizing component, but you're matching it on the other end with providing the human resources component. And not like, when I said human resources, and I did not mean HR, I meant like resources for humans in general. So I was like, that's not what I meant.
No, I follow. So in terms of from the employer standpoint, what are some actionable things that employers can do? Like, say that there's someone watching this show who's in a position where they might be able to invest in employee health, or someone who could advocate for their business to do some of this work. Are there some low-hanging fruits, some places where this is a high leverage or at least moderate leverage thing that isn't incredibly hard to do, like, say, enact cultural change throughout an organization? What could people do?
So I'm glad that you said the last thing that you said, because I just wanted to acknowledge to everybody listening how difficult culture and behavior change is and how long it takes. And this coming out of the past, 12, 13, 14 months, or possibly the years previous to, that's a lot to work to address, right? And it's not easy. And expectations, I think that when I used to do the work that I did, we would essentially, if you can help one person, you can help them, so it's sometimes it's helpful to look at small actions and to realize like a small action can absolutely change somebody's life. So when you're looking at some of the low hanging fruit options, I mean, part of it is, do you have a team at work who's already devoted towards wellness? We have a couple at the National Safety Council, right? So what does that look like? If you're here and you're like, I'm not on that team, I wonder what they're doing. Should I engage with them? The answer is yes, because in the long run, this does take a cross-organizational effort. You need leadership, you need supervisors, you need safety professionals and HR, and most importantly, you need employee buy-in. So what does that look like? So starting, some small ways to start, figure out who's working on it. Do your sleuthing around the organization, take that first kind of step and see what's what. For example, another option would be, hey, if you are listening to this and you're an HR person or a benefits person, or maybe you can suggest this to them, does your healthcare provider, do they have programs or classes in place that you can provide to the workplace? Stress management classes, meditation, whatever the case may be. And I'm not, that's just part of the kind of stuff that you can provide, maybe that doesn't cost a lot of money, for example, because you already are working with these people and maybe it's already covered in the offerings and you just haven't thought about it, kind of examining that. And then, the normalization of the conversation. And there are some very good exercises and toolbox talks or whatever that you can use at a meeting that we have at nsc.org and also other places as well, where you can take a look and say, how do I talk about, this, what do I do? If you're a supervisor and manager, what we mentioned earlier about saying, hey, just doing those normal weekly check-ins that aren't specific to, like, that kind of stuff can change people's lives. Next tier up, I would say, if you want to put together or find, it probably already exists, right? But what exists in your community, those things that, do I have a recovery organization I want to make sure that people know about? Or, is there a local NAMI chapter that maybe could, what does that look like? That kind of like short list of things in the community, making sure employees know about the EAP. Those types of things are really important. And then, on the larger scale, and this is something that I always think we should start as soon as possible, and that's why I'm mentioning it now in this kind of like small steps area, is it helping employees? What is the employee experience of what you're doing? And this is really important because, everybody experiences things like this differently. But if you are doing things that, people aren't attending a session, or they're not listening, or doesn't seem to, or you just don't know, like, here's our baseline. Did we affect positive change? We don't necessarily know unless we're asking the question. So employee engagement surveys, preferably anonymous, completely anonymous as opposed to confidential, preferably completely anonymous. I can't stress that enough. How is that experienced in the workplace? And then you can take a look at what's happened and what hasn't. And then I want to be clear, though, that, this is a two-way street. Employers and employees, you have to take those trust steps together. However, there are workplace factors. The onus is not on the employee to exist safely and healthily in an unsafe or unhealthy system, right? So things like job ambiguity, job stress, tension or conflict between workers in general, but also supervisor and employee, C-suite and whomever, et cetera, that excessive work, insufficient work, fear of losing one's job, harsh working conditions. And that's tough when people are working remotely. But if you are in person right now, lights and temperature and those kinds of things, these are things that an employee cannot control, which means that as the employer, understanding how those types of factors impact worker well-being, that the onus is on you to really address those larger systems.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's almost like there's two prongs here. On the one hand, for the employers, one is knowing what is actually affecting your employees.
Right.
So like what are people concerned about? Which you wouldn't know maybe unless you asked in those anonymous type surveys, as well as is what you're doing working, but then also providing, really putting that weight on your shoulders, because you are the one creating this environment, to make sure that it is physically safe, that it is emotionally safe, that it is recovery safe. to do that. That makes a lot of sense. I know for me as well, like it's, although some lifts are a little bit heavier, even just information alone can help a lot. So
Yep.
I do a lot of webinars, and recently I've been doing quite a bit on parenting strategies. And the slide that I always get the most positive feedback for is one where I go over a communication strategy for talking with teenagers that will actually make them more likely to interact with you, to work with you, as opposed to just push you away. And it
Right.
leverages some motivational interviewing strategies. And the comments that I always get are, I'm going to go try this right now. This is something that
That's
I can
awesome.
do. And yeah, and it feels really good. But it's not rocket science. But if people haven't been exposed to that framework for communicating, they might not think
Right.
about it. And so sometimes it's just as easy as education, or like you said about providing resources like partnerships. I know there's a lot of companies right now doing partnerships with smartphone apps,
Yep.
like for meditation or wellness or those sorts of
Right.
things, where even if it's more employee driven, like you put the resource in front of them, they have to be the ones to reach out and pull it to
Right.
them. Giving them the opportunity means that you might be able to help, whatever percentage of your staff that way.
Right. Yeah. And, learning, we've all learned a lot over the past year about how resilient we can be in different working conditions, right? Or in some cases, how resilient we can't be. That's also absolutely an option. And, I think about, you know, people even proactively engaging on like, how do you best do your work? What does that look like? And that provides a space for people to be able to, answer that question honestly. And I think that is, we're not going to ever know. It's tough. You can't accommodate everyone and everything in all of the different ways. And also I would like to point out that what people say once might change, and I think we have to give ourselves the grace to change as well. And to say like, hey, this is where I was at. And now I think I would like to try something different, because we all change. It's important. If we don't change and we don't learn and we don't grow, then what are we doing? But at the same time, that does come into the workplace in kind of an odd way, but really consistently engaging and saying, okay, so what works best, and enabling people to try new things and to also vocalize what they need would go a long way. And, making people feel heard, it's not always going to be possible, right? But having the conversation, and if you are, a manager or supervisor, doing what you can to accommodate, to help somebody grow, that is something that, we often look for, even without necessarily knowing that we're looking for it, right? So I think that's an important component of this too.
Yeah, and, something that occurred to me as you're talking about this is maybe there's a frame switch that would be helpful from the employer side, of instead of looking at employee wellness as an obligation, and maybe even an obligation that's not being met, view it as an opportunity. And that if you actually have been operating to this point and you don't have the most psychologically safe workplace, or you haven't been as seeing your employees as people as opposed to workers, this is an opportunity actually to really shore that up, and it's going to benefit you from top to bottom in the organization. It's not something to shy away from or to avoid because maybe you don't feel good about how things have gone. This is an opportunity for really positive growth.
I think so too, and I think that it's tough because when we're, like we've mentioned, infinite number of times over the past hour, we're all human. So people are going to be humans. They are going to make mistakes and things might go wrong, and you're going to try something and maybe it doesn't work. And it's important to, just because it doesn't work with one person doesn't mean that you're not succeeding. And I think that goes to that longevity conversation and taking a look and constantly evaluating what this is, because it just might not, sometimes it's just not the right fit. I mean, this better than anyone. When you're talking about addiction treatment, some things work for some people that just do not work for others. And it is not because anything is bad or doesn't work as a general rule, it's just, it doesn't work for that person, so maybe it's just not the right fit, and there's nothing that needs to be stigmatized, or it shouldn't be, it is not, it's never fun to not succeed, but it doesn't mean that, in the long run that you're not affecting positive change.
Yeah. Well, this has been incredibly informative. We are almost at the end of our time, though. So before we say goodbye, is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with? An idea, a call to action? Anything you'd like to say to finish up?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me right now, and has been for a while, is can we just giving, we're all tired and our resilience is all down, and that is okay. And giving yourself and others the grace to just be human, especially as we emerge out of, into the spring and in the summer and whatever that may bring. Um, giving ourselves grace and being able to recognize how extraordinarily difficult the past year has been, giving yourself the opportunity to grow, to think new things, to try new things, to set your own boundaries in a way that's helpful. I think that's something that is, I would say, just on a personal note, that I encourage everybody to stay in that space, even though it may not be comfortable. And I am absolutely the poster child for that not being comfortable, because I am, I talk about this and I still struggle to do it. So I fully recognize that it can be a really difficult space to be in. And for those of y'all who are, an employer or who are working on this workplace wellness stuff, I encourage you to start the process, to put one foot in front of the other, and also to realize that, a lot of us, especially in the workplace, want not easy solutions, but we want clear solutions. We want something to be fixed. And to your point earlier, it's like reframing. Are we reframing? Are we exploring this opportunity? And it may not be quote unquote fixed, but we are making progress. And that idea of affecting positive change can be sweeping, or it can be making one person's day a little bit easier. And I think that reframe, how do I affect positive change and take that step forward, makes this feel more possible. So I encourage you to explore that mentally and then in your workplace as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rachael, so much again for coming on the show today and for sharing all of your experience and all of your expertise in this area. I really appreciate it. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in, for watching today. Always a pleasure to have you with us. We're going to be finishing up for today, but definitely check back in a couple of weeks. We'll have another episode. But Rachael, if someone wants to get in touch with you or with NSC, with questions, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can feel free to email me directly. That's probably the easiest way. And it's Rachael, Rachael. Don't forget the extra A, otherwise it won't go nowhere. Rachael, Rachael.Cooper, Cooper at nsc.org.
Marvelous. All right. Well, thank you again. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.